The air inside the bustling mall was thick with the hum of chatter, the clink of shopping bags, and the faint echo of pop music spilling from overhead speakers. Jamal Williams stood just outside the gleaming glass doors of Lux & Co., a high-end store where the price tag screamed exclusivity. At 17, Jamal carried himself with a quiet confidence, his crisp button-up shirt tucked neatly into dark jeans, sneakers spotless, a silver watch glinting on his wrist.
Welcome to Shadow Crime. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating even better content. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started.
He leaned against a polished railing, scrolling through his phone, waiting for his friends to show up. The late afternoon light streamed through the skylights, casting a warm glow over the marble floors. But for Jamal, the moment felt anything but warm. He sensed it, the shift in the air, the unspoken weight of being watched. Across the walkway, Brian Carter stood in his starched security uniform, arms crossed, his broad frame rooted like a sentinel. Brian was in his late 30s, a man who'd spent years patrolling these pristine halls, his eyes trained to spot anything or anyone that didn't fit. And Jamal didn't fit. Not to Brian. The kid was too polished, too poised for a teenager waiting outside a store like this. Brian's gaze narrowed as he clocked Jamal's outfit, then flicked to the group of teens trickling toward him, laughing loud, a mix of baggy hoodies and ripped jeans. They belonged together, sure, but Jamal stood out, an outlier in Brian's mental checklist. "He doesn't look right," Brian muttered under his breath, his gut churning with a suspicion he couldn't quite name. There was no evidence, no crime, just a feeling, a hunch born from years of sizing people up in seconds. Maybe it was the way Jamal stood a little too still, or how his clothes screamed effort in a way the others didn't. Brian didn't need proof. He trusted his instincts, and they were ringing alarm bells now. He adjusted his belt, the clink of his keys cutting through the mall's din, and started toward the group, his stride purposeful, eyes locked on Jamal like a hunter zeroing in on prey. Jamal felt the shift before he saw it. That familiar prickle crawled up his neck, the one he'd learned to recognize since he was old enough to walk through places like this. He glanced up from his phone, catching Brian's approach in his peripheral vision. The stiff posture, the hard stare. His stomach tightened, but he kept his face neutral, his thumbs pausing over the screen. His friends were close now, their voices bouncing off the walls, oblivious to the storm brewing just steps away. Jamal braced himself, knowing what was coming, knowing this wasn't about what he'd done, but who he was. Brian stopped short, his shadow falling over Jamal. The confrontation was seconds away, and the mall's polished sheen couldn't hide the tension about to crack wide open. The hum of the mall faded into a distant buzz as Brian Carter planted himself in front of Jamal Williams and his friends, his broad shoulders squared, his voice cut through the chatter like a blunt blade. "What are you kids doing here?" he demanded, his tone heavy with authority, eyes sweeping over the group. The teens shuffled awkwardly, some smirked, others shrugged, caught off guard by the sudden interrogation. A lanky boy with a hoodie piped up, "Just waiting, man. Chill." His voice half laughing, half annoyed, but Brian barely registered the answer. His gaze had already locked onto Jamal, the outlier in his crisp shirt and steady posture, standing apart from the casual chaos of the group. "You," Brian said, jabbing a finger toward Jamal, his voice dropping an octave. "What's your story? Why are you here?" The question wasn't a request. It was an accusation dripping with skepticism. Jamal straightened, slipping his phone into his pocket, meeting Brian's stare with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside him. "I'm waiting for my friends," he said, his words clear, deliberate, no hint of a waver. "That's it." His friends nodded, one muttering, "Yeah, he's with us," but their voices were background noise to Brian. He didn't buy it, not the explanation, not the poise, not the kid standing there like he belonged. Brian stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Jamal's frame. "Waiting, huh?" He scoffed, his lip curling. "Let's see about that. Empty your pockets, now." The command landed like a slap, sharp and unyielding. Jamal's eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "What? Why?" he asked, voice steady but edged with incredulity. Brian's jaw tightened. "I've seen enough shoplifters in my time, kid. You're gonna prove you're not one of them. Pockets, let's go." There was no evidence, no stolen goods in sight, just Brian's hunch, his gut telling him Jamal was hiding something, even if his hands were empty. Jamal didn't budge. "I didn't do anything," he said, his tone firm, rooted in a quiet defiance. "I don't have to show you nothing." He knew his rights, had learned them the hard way, from hushed family talks and late-night scrolls through online forums. Brian's face flushed, a vein ticking at his temple. That refusal, that calm resistance, it lit a spark in him. "You don't, huh?" he snapped, stepping in so close Jamal could feel the heat off him. "You want to make this hard? Keep it up and we'll do this the ugly way." His hand hovered near his radio, a threat unspoken but loud, the air between them, crackling with menace. The group fell silent, eyes darting between Jamal and Brian. A small crowd was forming now, shoppers pausing, phones creeping out of pockets. Jamal held his ground, heart pounding, as Brian's pressure tightened like a noose. The mall's polished facade couldn't mask it. This was about to blow. The standoff in the mall's gleaming corridor teetered on a razor's edge. Jamal Williams stood firm, his voice unwavering despite the storm in his chest. "I'm not a thief," he said again, each word a brick in the wall he'd built against Brian Carter's accusations. "You've got no reason to touch me." His friends hovered nearby, their earlier bravado fading into nervous glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. Brian's face twisted, his patience unraveling like a frayed rope. "You don't tell me what I've got," he snarled, and in a flash his hand shot out, clamping down on Jamal's arm with a grip like iron. Jamal flinched, instinct kicking in. He yanked his arm back, not hard, but enough to break free, his voice rising for the first time. "Get off me!" The sudden motion jolted the scene into chaos. Brian staggered a half step, his eyes flashing with fury. Jamal's resistance was fuel on a fire already blazing. "You want to fight me, kid?" he barked, lunging forward again, his bulk towering over Jamal. The air crackled, charged with the promise of violence as the teen braced himself, hands up but not swinging, caught between fear and defiance. Heads turned, shoppers froze mid-stride, their bags dangling forgotten. A ripple of gasps spread through the growing crowd as phones emerged from pockets, lenses glinting like eyes in the artificial light. "Yo, he's grabbing him!" a voice shouted, followed by the soft click of cameras rolling. A teenage girl whispered to her friend, "This is messed up," her phone angled to catch every second. The scene was no longer just a confrontation. It was a spectacle, raw and unfiltered, unfolding in real time for an audience that stretched beyond the mall's walls. From the edge of the chaos, Sophia Miller watched it all unfold. A fellow security guard, she'd been on her rounds when the commotion pulled her in. She was younger than Brian, mid-20s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense stride, her uniform crisp, but her demeanor softer. She'd worked with Brian long enough to know his temper, his tendency to lean hard into his hunches. But this was different. She saw Jamal's open hands, heard his steady protests, and clocked the absence of anything incriminating. Then she saw Brian's grip, the wild edge in his voice, and the phones lighting up like fireflies. Her gut twisted. He was crossing a line, and if she didn't step in, this wouldn't just end badly, it'd explode. "Brian!" Sophia's voice cut through the din, sharp and commanding as she pushed through the onlookers. She planted herself between him and Jamal, her hand raised, not touching but firm. "Back off, now!" Her tone was steel, her stare locked on Brian, daring him to push further. The crowd held its breath, cameras still rolling as the tension hung like a guillotine, waiting to drop. The air in the mall's corridor buzzed with tension, a live wire sparking between Brian Carter and Sophia Miller. Her command, "Back off! Now!" still echoed, her outstretched hand a barrier between Brian's fury and Jamal Williams' defiance. The crowd pressed closer, phones aloft, their screens capturing every heartbeat of the standoff. Brian's face was a storm cloud, flushed red and trembling with rage. His fist still clenched, as if he might shove past Sophia and finish what he'd started. But before he could move, Jamal's voice sliced through the chaos, steady and sharp, like a blade cutting fog. "Enough," Jamal said, stepping forward, his eyes locked on Brian. The tremble in his hands was gone, replaced by a fire that hadn't been there before. "You want to know who I am? My name's Jamal Williams. My dad? He's Marcus Williams, the guy who owns this mall." The words dropped like a bomb, heavy and deliberate, each syllable ringing with a truth that shifted the ground beneath them all. A gasp rippled through the crowd, heads snapping to whispers. "No way," a girl muttered, her phone dipping as she processed it. Brian froze, his arm halfway raised, his mouth parted but silent, the color draining from his face. Sophia blinked, her stance softening for a split second as she turned to Jamal. "Wait, what?" she stammered, caught off guard but quick to recalibrate. Brian, though, was a statue, his mind racing to catch up. Marcus Williams wasn't just a name, it was power, the kind of power that signed paychecks and made rules. And Brian had just grabbed his son, accused him of theft, all on a hunch that now felt like quicksand swallowing him whole. The weight of his mistake crashed down, his chest tightening as the reality sank in. He'd picked the wrong fight, with the wrong kid, in the wrong place. Jamal didn't flinch. His friends gaped, one whispering, "Bro, you serious?" But he ignored them, his focus laser-sharp on Brian. "You messed up," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a gavel. "And I'm done with this. Get the mall manager down here now." It wasn't a request, it was an order, backed by the sudden authority of his name, his lineage. The crowd buzzed louder, phones tilting to zoom in on Brian's stunned face, the footage already primed to go viral. Sophia nodded, stepping back to thumb her radio. "This is Miller. I need the manager at Lux & Co. ASAP. We've got a situation." Her eyes flicked to Brian, a mix of pity and warning. Brian's hand fell limp to his side, his bravado shattered, replaced by a dawning dread. Jamal stood tall, the son of a king reclaiming his ground, while the mall's polished walls seemed to close in on Brian. The reckoning was coming, and everyone, cameras rolling, knew it. Within hours, the mall showdown was no longer confined to the polished corridors of Lux & Co. It was everywhere. The shaky footage from the crowd's phones hit social media like a match to dry grass, spreading across TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram with hashtags like #Justice for Jamal and #Mall Bias. The video was raw, Brian Carter's hulking figure looming over Jamal Williams, his hand gripping the teen's arm, his voice barking accusations, all while Jamal stood his ground, calm but unyielding. Then came the bombshell, Jamal revealing. His father owned the mall, followed by Brian's stunned silence. Each frame was a spark, and the internet was gasoline. By nightfall, the clip had racked up millions of views, comments flooding in like a tidal wave. "This is why we can't just be anywhere," one user wrote, racking up thousands of likes. "Bro's dad owns the place, and this clown still profiled him," another raged. Activists shared it with captions demanding accountability. Influencers stitched it with reactions, their furrowed brows and shaking heads amplifying the outrage. News outlets picked it up, headlines screaming, "Teen harassed by security at father's own mall." And suddenly, Jamal wasn't just a kid in a crisp shirt. He was a symbol, a face for a reckoning long overdue. The backlash hit the mall like a sledgehammer. The pristine image of the upscale shopping center, once a beacon of luxury, crumbled under a storm of criticism. Shoppers posted boycott calls, tagging the mall's official accounts, "Fix your staff or lose our money." Online reviews tanked, one-stars piling up with stories of others who'd felt judged, watched, unwelcome. The pressure was suffocating, and the mall's PR team scrambled, issuing a statement that felt flimsy against the fury. "We're aware of the incident and are conducting a thorough investigation." But it wasn't enough. The public demanded blood, and the spotlight swiveled to Brian. For Brian Carter, the fall was swift and brutal. By morning, the mall suspended him pending the investigation, his badge stripped, his name plastered across every platform as the face of injustice. He sat in his cramped apartment, staring at his phone as notifications piled up. Hate messages, threats, screenshots of his own words looped back to haunt him. His 10 years of service, his gut instincts, his pride, all ash now. Friends went silent, his inbox overflowed with reporters he couldn't face. He'd misjudged Jamal, and the cost wasn't just his job. It was his entire world, unraveling pixel by pixel in viral infamy. Jamal, meanwhile, stayed quiet, his phone off as the storm raged. The mall's investigation loomed, but the damage was done. Brian's career was a smoking ruin, and the mall's reputation hung by a thread. The video kept looping, a digital echo of a moment that refused to fade, pulling everyone deeper into its wake. The investigation into Brian Carter's actions didn't take long. The evidence was undeniable, etched in viral footage and eyewitness accounts. A week after the video turned the mall into a battleground of public outrage, the management delivered. Their verdict: Brian was fired, effective immediately. His termination letter was cold and formal, citing conduct unbecoming and violation of protocol, but behind the legalese was a clear message. The mall couldn't afford him anymore. The announcement came with a broader pledge. Lux & Cubbier would overhaul its security training, rooting out racial bias with mandatory workshops and stricter oversight. It was a desperate bid to claw back their reputation, a shiny press release, meant to douse the flames still licking at their brand. For Jamal Williams, though, it wasn't enough. Sitting in his room, the weight of the past week pressed down. Every replay of the video, every headline with his name, every stranger's comment calling him a hero or a victim. Brian's firing was justice, sure, but it felt hollow. A bandage on a wound that ran deeper than one man's prejudice. Jamal didn't just want punishment, he wanted prevention. He'd felt that grip on his arm, seen that suspicion in Brian's eyes, and knew it wasn't unique to him. It was a shadow cast over kids like him every day. "This can't keep happening," he told his dad over breakfast, his voice quiet but resolute. Marcus Williams, the mall's Titan owner, nodded, pride flickering in his eyes. "Then make it stop," he said. Jamal took that charge to heart. Days later, he walked into a sterile conference room, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, facing a table of mall executives in stiff suits. At 17, he was the youngest there, his crisp shirt a stark contrast to their ties, but his presence carried a gravity they couldn't ignore. "I'm not here to gloat," he started, his voice steady, eyes sweeping the room. "Brian's gone, fine. But what about the next Brian? What's stopping this from happening again?" He laid out demands, new policies, not just promises, body cameras for guards, clear rules on stops and searches, a hotline for complaints that actually got heard. His words weren't polished, but they were raw, forged in the fire of that day. Outside Lux & Co., the execs shifted, some nodding, others scribbling notes. Sophia Miller, reinstated after backing Jamal, sat in the corner, a silent ally. The room buzzed with tension, but Jamal didn't waver. He wasn't just Marcus's son here. He was a voice, a force, pushing for a future where no one else had. To feel that prickle of unwarranted suspicion. The mall had bent under public pressure, but Jamal was determined to break the mold entirely. Change was coming, and he'd make damn sure it stuck. Brian Carter's world had shrunk to the four walls of his dim apartment, the blinds drawn tight against a reality he couldn't face. Fired from the mall, his name was now a punchline, a hashtag, a cautionary tale splashed across screens he couldn't escape. The man who'd once strutted those polished corridors with unshakable confidence now sat hunched on a sagging couch, staring at a muted TV flickering with news loops of his downfall. Security guard sacked after viral bias. Incident, the Chiron read, his grainy face frozen in that moment of rage. Messages piled up, old co-workers distancing themselves, strangers hurling venom, but he didn't reply. The truth gnawed at him. His gut, his prized instincts, had been wrong. Worse, they'd been poisoned by a lens he'd never questioned, and that blindness had torched his career, his pride, his everything. He was a ghost now, haunted by his own shadow. Across town, Sophia Miller wrestled with her own ghosts. She stood in the mall's security office, her uniform crisp but her heart heavy, replaying that day outside Lux & Co. She'd stepped in, sure, but too late. After Brian's hand had already grabbed Jamal, after the phones were rolling. "I should have moved faster," she muttered to her reflection in a cracked mirror, the guilt a stone in her gut. She'd seen Brian's edge before, his quick triggers, but she'd let it slide, hoping it wouldn't boil over. It had, and she'd been complicit in the silence, no more. She vowed it then, zipping up her jacket with a new resolve. She'd be the guard who listened, who questioned, who didn't let bias call the shots. Jamal's stand had shaken her awake, and she wouldn't sleep through it again. For Jamal Williams, the victory felt bittersweet. He sat on his bed, the city skyline glinting through his window, a privilege tied to his father's name. The mall was changing. New rules, new training, his voice echoing in those boardroom promises. But the weight of that day lingered. He'd won, but not because he was right. He'd won because of who his dad was. Without that shield, what then? The crisp shirt, the silver watch, the calm words. None of it had stopped Brian's suspicion from zeroing in on his skin. "I'm still just a target," he whispered, the realization cutting deep. Power and status had bent the outcome, but they couldn't erase the prickle on his neck, the instinct to brace for judgment in every room he entered. He'd fought for change, but he knew now. No title, no wealth could fully armor him against a world that saw him first as a threat. The ripples of that day stretched wide, Brian broken, Sophia reborn, Jamal sobered. The mall's facade gleamed, but beneath it, the scars of truth pulsed, unhealed. Brian Carter's bitterness festered in the weeks after his firing, a sour knot twisting tighter with every replay of the viral video, every snub from a former friend. He'd pace his cluttered apartment, the silence broken only by the creak of the floorboards, muttering curses at the world, at Jamal, at the mall, at the faceless millions who'd branded him a villain. "It wasn't my fault," he'd growl, kicking a stray sock across the room. "Kid was in the wrong place, wrong time. They blew it up." But the excuses rang hollow, even to him. Late at night, staring at the ceiling, the truth crept in. Like a thief, he'd seen Jamal's skin, not his story, and that snap judgment had cost him everything. The anger burned out, leaving a raw, aching question. What now? One grey morning, he found a flyer slipped under his door, some local workshop on racial bias and restorative justice. He almost trashed it, but something stopped him. Maybe it was boredom, maybe shame. He showed up, slouched in a folding chair at the back, arms crossed, expecting a lecture. Instead, he got stories, people like him, people he'd judged, peeling back layers he'd never bothered to see. The facilitator, a wiry guy with a calm voice, asked, "When's the last time you questioned your gut?" Brian flinched. He stayed silent that first session, but he kept coming back. Week by week, he listened, scribbled notes, started asking why he'd seen threat where there was none. It was slow, messy, like unlearning a language he'd spoken his whole life. Months later, in a community center basement, Brian sat straighter, a notebook open, his pen pausing as a new speaker. Stepped up, Jamal Williams. The room hushed, eyes flicking between them, Brian's broad frame, Jamal's poised stance. Jamal didn't flinch, his voice steady as he recounted that day at the mall, not with anger, but clarity. I wanted change, not revenge. Brian's throat tightened, memories crashing back, his grip, his snarl, his downfall. When Jamal finished, the room clapped, but Brian barely heard it. He stood, hesitant, as people milled around for coffee. Jamal turned, their eyes meeting, and for a beat, the past hung heavy between them. Then Brian stepped forward, hand outstretched. I was wrong, he said, voice rough but real. I'm trying to get it right now. Jamal studied him, then took his hand, grip firm. Keep trying, he said, a faint nod sealing it. No cameras, no crowd, just two men scarred by the same moment reaching across it. The handshake wasn't absolution, but understanding, a fragile bridge built from rubble. For Brian, it was a start. For Jamal, a sign the fight might just be worth it. The Lux and Common Mall emerged from its reckoning with a new heartbeat. Months after Brian's firing and Jamal's stand, the management rolled out a sweeping anti-discrimination program, a promise carved into action. Security guards, new hires, and veterans alike filed into training rooms, their radios silent as facilitators unpacked bias like a hidden thread in their daily routines. You don't see it till you look, one trainer said, flashing slides of unconscious triggers, a hoodie, a glance, a skin tone. Sophia Miller sat in the front row, nodding, her pen scratching notes. The sessions weren't perfect. Eyes rolled, grumbles slipped out. But they stuck. Guards started pausing, questioning, catching themselves before a hunch became a handcuff. The mall's polished halls felt lighter, less like a stage for suspicion, a quiet shift born from a loud fight. Jamal Williams didn't stop at the mall's walls. That day outside Lux & Co. had lit something in him, a fire he couldn't douse. At 18 now, he stood in school auditoriums and community centers, his voice steady, his story raw. It's not just one guard, one moment, he'd say, pacing the stage, kids' eyes locked on him. It's everywhere, stores, streets, the way we look at each other. He showed the viral clip, not for clout, but context, breaking down, how bias sneaks into the everyday. Teens nodded, some teary, others fired up, passing his words like torchlight. Local orgs tapped him for panels. His name grew, not as Marcus's son, but as Jamal, activist, voice, force. He wasn't loud, but he was relentless, planting seeds for a world that saw people, not profiles. Brian Carter found his own path, jagged but forward. The security gig was gone. His badge, his swagger, relics of a past he'd torched, but he didn't fade. After those workshops, he lingered, asking questions, digging deeper. Soon, he was volunteering with a justice reform group, a hulking figure in a room of advocates, his hands once clenched in anger, now passing out flyers. I was the problem once, he'd tell Paralese, ex-cops, anyone who'd listen, his voice low, honest. Don't be me. He mentored, shared his fall, helped rewrite training manuals, small steps to undo a big wrong. It wasn't redemption. Not fully, but a reckoning he lived every day, paying forward what he couldn't take back. The mall hummed on, its training a model for others. Jamal's talks rippled outward, a quiet revolution in classrooms and beyond. Brian's work carved a dent in a system he'd once propped up. 3 lives, once collided in chaos, now wove a thread of change. Fragile, imperfect, but real. The video faded from feeds, but its echo endured. A boy who stood, a guard who fell, a fight that reshaped more than a building. The story closed, but the work stretched on. The story of Jamal Williams and Brian Carter unfolds like a mirror to our lives. reflecting truths that grow sharper with age. For those of us who've seen decades pass, it's a reminder that judgment, swift and unexamined, can unravel years of hard-earned stability. Brian, a man seasoned by routine, let bias steer him into ruin, proving that experience alone doesn't shield us from folly. The lesson here is humbling. No matter our years, we must keep peeling back our assumptions. Age brings wisdom, but only if we're willing to question the lenses we've worn too long. In our twilight, when habits ossify, this story urges us to stay curious, to pause before we point, lest we topple our own legacies. Jamal's journey offers another gem. Resilience isn't just for the young. At 17, he turned a wound into a megaphone, not for revenge, but reform. For older folks, this speaks to purpose beyond retirement. Our battles, whether with health, loss, or a changing world, don't end our influence. Like Jamal, we can wield our voices, sharing stories at the kitchen table or the community hall, nudging the next generation toward fairness. His privilege didn't save him from prejudice, a stark nod that status fades before perception. It's a call to empathy. We've all felt unseen at times by a doctor, a neighbor, a child, and that shared ache can bridge divides if we let it. Sophia's guilt-turned growth whispers a final truth. It's never too late to pivot. Older age can feel like a tally of regrets, moments we didn't act or speak, yet she stepped up late but firm and rebuilt herself. For us, this is grace, permission to mend old wrongs, to tutor a grandchild in kindness, to challenge a friend's offhand remark. Brian's redemption, slow and unglamorous, echoes this. Our mistakes don't define us if we labor to right them. This tale, born in a mall's glare, lands in our laps with quiet power. Check your biases, wield your scars, act when it counts. Timeless acts of courage that age only refines. We're not done learning, not done mattering. That's the legacy. Worth leaving?